Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
So, today we're traveling back a bit. We're looking at an article called The New Psychology by Stanley Hall.
Yeah, written way back in 1885.
Exactly. And it's really a snapshot of psychology just as it's, well, starting to become its own thing in American universities.
Mm-hmm. Trying to figure out its place, next to philosophy, next to the sciences. It was a defining moment.
Definitely. So our mission here for you listening is sort of unpack what Hall meant by this new psychology. What were his big ideas? Why did he think it was important?
In what areas did he think it should actually study? We want to give you a good sense of these foundational concepts.
Right. So Hall starts by painting a picture of where psychology stood back then. Pretty new as a university subject in the U.S.
Yeah, very much growing out of philosophy departments, really.
And philosophy itself, he points out, had kind of a mixed history, didn't it? Sometimes dominant, sometimes less so.
Absolutely. Periods where it was huge, then periods where theology or later science seemed to take over the big questions.
And Hall noticed something interesting about philosophy compared to other fields.
Yeah, he observed there wasn't much agreement, on methods, on the core problems, even the overall scope. It was quite fragmented.
Which, in a way, created an opening, maybe.
That seems to be Hall's take, especially in the U.S., which he called a virgin field, less tied down by old European traditions.
He saw a growing intellectual curiosity about psychological stuff.
Definitely. So Hall's big push was psychology needs to get scientific. It needs proper methods. Move beyond just describing things. It should tackle real national needs education, even religion.
So a real shift from just thinking about the mind to studying it scientifically.
Precisely. That was the core of his new psychology vision.
Okay, so what specific areas did Hall see this new psychology tackling? He starts with instinct, right?
He does, and that was a really big topic then. He mentions Schelling saw instinct as a kind of test case for philosophy.
But Hall wasn't too impressed with a lot of the writing on it.
Not at all. He thought most of it was, unscientific, illogical even.
He had some examples, didn't he? Like comparing animals to machines.
Yeah, or that other extreme, attributing their smarts to some kind of world soul. He found both ideas lacking.
So what was his solution?
Careful, painstaking observation, really studying individual species in detail.
Like proper field work.
Exactly. He points to people like Erber studying trapdoor spiders, or Darwin's famous work on earthworms, that level of detail.
And he saw value beyond just pure science.
Oh, absolutely. Practical value, understanding pests, diseases, that kind of thing. But also understanding ourselves.
How so?
Well, he suggested that maybe some human things, impulses, attention, maybe even conscience have instinctive roots. It connects us to the animal kingdom.
Interesting. He even briefly mentions vegetable psychology.
Yeah. That was Taylor's idea, looking for intelligent-like movements in plants. Hall thought it was maybe a bit premature.
Okay, moving on. The next big area, experimental psychology. This feels very different.
Totally. This is where the lab coats come in, metaphorically speaking. It really starts with physiology.
Studying nerves and muscles outside the body.
Right, like Galvani's early work with Krog's legs. Though the initial ideas about vital force turned out to be wrong.
But the tools got better. He mentions things like the multiplicator.
Crucial. Better instruments meant better measurements, which opened the door to studying things like reflex action scientifically.
Reflexes, like knee-jerk reactions.
Basically, yeah. He traces the idea back, mentions Megany and Johannes Miller really establishing its importance in neurology.
There were debates, too, weren't there, about linking mind and body.
Oh, yes. Concerns that explaining things physically might undermine the idea of a soul or free will.
But the science progressed. He mentions Wundt.
Yes, Wundt was key in trying to synthesize understanding. And then there's E.H. Weber's work. Really groundbreaking.
On touch and pressure.
Decades of super careful experiments. He came up with a psychophysics law, basically, finding a mathematical link between a physical stimulus and how we perceive it. Think about noticing the difference between two slightly different weights.
Wow. Quantifying perception.
Exactly. And similar advances were happening in vision research, understanding the retina, and in acoustics, too.
So breaking down mental experiences.
That's the key. Helmholtz was brilliant at this, analyzing things that seemed simple into their basic components. And remember, Mueller thought you couldn't measure nerve speed.
But Helmholtz did it.
Helmholtz did it. Big step. Hall also talks about the personal equation.
What's that?
It's basically acknowledging that different observers have slightly different reaction times. Accounting for that allowed them to measure simpler mental processes, memory, association, attention under controlled conditions.
Fascinating. Okay, next up, the brain itself.
Right, becoming its own super specialized field. Hall notes, like astronomy.
And they were starting to map it.
Yeah, mainly by studying patients. If someone had an injury and lost a specific function, like speech or moving a limb, they could start linking that function to the damaged brain area.
He mentioned some key researchers, Monk, Meinert, Goltz.
With different theories about how areas work together, association fibers, even some functional recovery after damage.
And he noted something about the frontal lobes.
Yeah, that even back then it seemed like the temporal region sides of the brain had more functions clearly mapped than the frontal region. Still a bit of a mystery then.
But the evidence pointed towards localized processes.
Definitely. Specific nerve fibers, groups of cells doing specific jobs. But Hall also adds a philosophical point.
Which is?
That the gap between the physical brain processes and our subjective feeling of consciousness is huge. He saw that as a real challenge to purely materialistic views, that utter incommensurability, as he put it.
Makes sense. Then he turns to symptoms in abnormal states.
Yeah, an area with growing research. Detailed studies of insanity, delirium, epilepsy, aphasia, loss of language, even dreams.
And the key was comparison.
Exactly. Comparing the psychic observations with the physical state. Like finding discoloration in the brain's cortex in someone with mania.
And studying this requires a special kind of person, he thought.
Yeah, a mix of empathy, really understanding the person's experience, and objective scientific thinking. Sagacity, he calls it.
And it had practical value, too.
For sure. Important for treatment, obviously, but also for teaching pedagogic value.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Historical psychology.
Right. Hall saw this as maybe more directly valuable for humanities students, whereas experimental psych was more for the science-minded.
And this reflected a trend in Germany.
Yeah, German philosophy was moving away from just building grand systems and more towards analyzing and critiquing the history of ideas.
What's the benefit of looking back, according to Hall?
Several things. Avoids reinventing the wheel, intellectually speaking, deepens understanding of where our current ideas came from, just gives you a broader perspective.
How do you study historical psychology?
By looking for the roots of thought and feeling. You could look at how individuals develop, study so-called savage races, a term we wouldn't use now. Of course, analyze language history, compare myths, laws, art across cultures.
Like a kind of higher anthropology.
That's his phrase, yeah. Searching for those fundamental primeval notions that underpin human thinking.
And philosophy fits in how?
Hall kind of viewed philosophy at its best as a more structured, elaborate expression of this basic psychic groundwork.
He uses Greek philosophy as an example.
Right, emphasizing how it grew organically from Greek culture and ideals, like Plato's ideal of the beautiful good. It wasn't just abstract, it was tied to their way of life.
So how did Hall see psychology relating to philosophy overall? It wasn't trying to replace it, was it?
No, definitely not. Or become some kind of philosophy of philosophy. He saw it as offering a valid perspective on philosophy.
Like looking at the history of philosophy
As the natural history of the mind. How human minds have grappled with big questions over time.
And it needed to be interdisciplinary.
Yes. Connect philosophy's history with the history of science, religion, medicine, even the biographies of the thinkers themselves. Look for the underlying patterns, the larger human logic weaving through it all.
And through that lens, he saw three main strands in philosophy.
Kind of, yeah. He traces one line focused on the concept or form, from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, through scholasticism, Hegel, even ideas about fixed types in nature.
Okay, what else?
Then there's the mechanical tradition. Think Democritus, Descartes' mechanical view of the body, Herbert, psychophysics, Spinoza, a more materialist or mechanistic view.
And the third?
Self-consciousness, stemming more from the Reformation, leading to thinkers like Hume and Kant, focusing on introspection, how our own minds structure experience.
But these traditions weren't really talking to each other.
Largely not, Hall observed. They remain pretty separate. And he sort of hoped psychology might help mediate, find some higher unity between them eventually.
Interesting ambition. He also touched on psychology and education and religion.
Briefly, yeah. He saw psychological understanding as valuable for religion, especially in an age where lots of people were discussing it. Maybe rescuing what he called the higher mythopoeic faculties, our capacity for myth and meaning, from sheer prejudice.
A path to reconciliation, perhaps?
Potentially, yeah. Reconciling modern culture and religious belief through deeper psychological insight.
And where did he see psychology fitting among all the academic disciplines?
Well, he disagreed with John Stuart Mill's idea that universities exist only for philosophy.
Okay.
And it wasn't a science of sciences like Comte or Hegel envisioned, more like, well, like mathematics is for the exact sciences,
How so?
providing fundamental relationships, precise and verifiable concepts that other disciplines could build on, a more defined foundational role.
Finally, he brings it back to the practical relevance of philosophy itself.
Yeah, he argues that historically, the truly great philosophers connected with the real needs and questions of ordinary people.
And he saw potential in America.
He did. With the right cultivation, he thought American life and thought could produce really valuable philosophy, this idea of a true science of man, if wisdom could be gathered, that truly expressed the total life of the people. A pretty grand vision.
So wrapping up this deep dive into G. Stanley Hall's 1885 article, we've really seen his blueprint for a psychology that's both scientific and historically aware.
Yeah, exploring everything from instinct and reflexes to the brain, mental illness, and even the history of philosophy itself, all with this idea of applying scientific rigor.
It's quite a scope he laid out.
Absolutely. Trying to understand the mind from multiple angles and seeing its relevance to education, religion, and just human life in general.
So a final thought for you, our listener. How do Hall's ideas from way back then strike you today? What parts feel familiar, maybe even still relevant in psychology now?
And was completely different. What new features, maybe ones Hall couldn't have even imagined, has psychology taken on since 1885? Are we still wrestling with some of the same fundamental questions he raised?
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.